Everyone, I want to welcome you to Interfaith Paths to Peace. This is our 3 o'clock program on Wednesdays called Community Conversations, where we offer a variety of topics. This week, I'm going to be doing a presentation on the Golden Rule, interfaith perspectives, and asking some questions about, is the Golden Rule in need of improvement? But we're also going to be looking at different ways that religious traditions have understood the Golden Rule. It's one of those universal ideas that shows up in different times and places and geographies and different religious traditions as a moral code. So I'm going to jump in and talk some about different perspectives on the Golden Rule and different ways that we might see and understand it. This is a presentation, I must admit, that I did with the Kentucky Council of Churches annual meeting about a month ago, and they asked me to speak on it. So I'm redoing for the public, so to speak, this conversation on the Golden Rule that I originally gave at the Kentucky Council of Churches gathering. So if you're joining us on Facebook, would welcome you, and you're, of course, welcome to include in the comments section different comments or questions that you may have as we go. Always like to include people that are joining us on Facebook. So thanks for jumping in there and joining. And always like to have you involved in the conversation. So use the chat box as a way of being involved in the conversation. If you're joining us on Zoom, there'll be opportunity as well for you to engage in the conversation. Thanks for joining us there. So basically, I want to look at the Golden Rule, which kind of in the Western American context, we primarily understand that came through the Christian tradition. In the basic comment, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So there's a couple things that I want to do today in the presentation. One is I want to look at the Golden Rule from multi-faith perspectives and see how they nuance it or change it and how that relates maybe to their cosmology or their theological perspective. And second, I want to look at what's the strengths and the weaknesses behind the Golden Rule as a moral compass or a moral statement about how to treat other people. Third, I want to place it within the context of what we know in moral development theory. I'll be looking at Piaget, or excuse me, Kohlberg and Carol Gilligan. And so we'll be understanding how the Golden Rule may function within the concept of moral development. And then I'm going to offer what I think may be an upgrade. The Platinum Rule and the Spirit Rule, and then we'll look at different practices for living the Golden Rule at the end. So that's what I hope to do in our time together. So here's a really nice diagram or a visual that talks about the different phrases that our different spiritual and religious traditions have used around the Golden Rule. So I want to look at these a little more intently and specifically understand them within the context of the theological worldview or the cosmology of these different religious traditions, and talk how they're a little bit nuanced and different while still seeking to explain a very similar moral principle. We'll start with Christianity, and this comes from Matthew 7. And I think to understand the context, you have to understand really what Matthew is talking about in Matthew 7. So it comes in a real specific spot. I'm not going to go into that necessarily, but I think to understand this one verse, you need to understand the complexity of it is a verse that talks about morality. And so while this seems a little bit simplistic, maybe, it comes in a really more challenging context in Matthew 7. But again, we've heard this one, in everything do to others as you would have them do to you, for this is the law and the prophets. So Jesus, in this context, is taking all of the law and the prophets, which were the Hebrew religion, the Jewish tradition from which he came. He summarized the law and the prophets in this one saying. And we can look how that is a little bit worded a little bit differently. So from Judaism, and this comes from the Talmud, there's a similar phrase: what is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. This is the whole Torah. All the rest is commentary. The transition here is interesting, and we'll see this in other traditions where they take the negative rather than the positive. And we can ask why this is not said in the positive, but this is, and you'll see in other traditions as well, it's the negative of this. So what's hurtful or what's hateful or what diminishes another person, do not do that to your neighbor. So Jesus rephrases this in a positive way. And we can ask, is that significant? Would this be different if you're asking the positive, like how should I act towards somebody? And then you ask the question, well, how would I want them to act to me? And then you do that. Or is it different if you were to say, wow, I really don't want this. Maybe I shouldn't do that. So it's a different way of engaging a very similar moral principle. One is from the positive and one is from the negative. And we'll see how that is similar in different traditions. If we look at the other monotheistic tradition, again, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam are known as the main three monotheistic traditions. And Islam is the most monotheistic of that. In fact, a prime example of monotheism. In Islam, it said, not one of you truly believes until you wish for others what you wish for yourself. So here's a little bit different. It's the language of want in a futuristic concept or a futuristic time, what you wish for others until you wish for others what you wish for yourself. So here's this kind of a transformation of one's moral centering is that you would begin to understand what you want for yourself, and that is what you would wish for another person. Islam frames it within not one of you truly believes, and this concept of Islam, of belief, is really this it's not necessarily a cognitive beliefs. It's more of this, is your heart set on the worship and the surrender to Allah? So it's kind of a saying, if you've surrendered your life and your will to Allah, because the repercussion of that is that you will wish for others what you wish for yourself. So it's kind of a marker of who really believes or who has surrendered oneself to God. So again, you can see a little bit of a different context in that tradition. The Baha'i faith, in some ways, would be monotheistic. It came in the context of a Middle Eastern religion in Iran, but it did come out of Islam. So the earliest founders of the Baha'i tradition came out of Islam, and Islam has been persecuted as well. That's part of its history. And so there's a little bit different framing here from the Baha'i faith, which again, we could call a monotheistic tradition. Although it's open to other religious traditions, it's grounded in a monotheistic Islamic tradition. Here they say, lay not on any soul a load that you would not wish to be laid upon you, and desire not for anyone the things you would not desire for yourself. Again, it's using oneself as a reference for how to treat another person, but there's a little bit different language behind it in the Baha'i tradition. Now, when we move out of the Baha'i tradition, we move into polytheism, or Hinduism is really interesting. It's hard to put Hinduism into a category because it has so much diversity. Again, Hinduism is really a geographic, all of the religions practiced historically within the continent or the country of India. And it's really everything below the Indus River where these religions formed and took shape, which is called Hinduism. But Hinduism is such a vast term of the way in which the people practiced their religion. It's really hard to name it. It has some polytheism, which is the worship of multiple gods. It does have some monotheistic traditions, and it's got some philosophical monism is another way in which we understand some of the practices in Hinduism. But anyway, you can see that they also have a concept. This is the sum of duty. Do not do to others what would cause pain if done to you. Again, it's based upon the negative, what you would experience as being negative. Don't do that, or don't wish that upon another. So again, you see that in the Hindu tradition coming in the negative form. In Buddhism, again, Buddhism emerged out of Hinduism. Siddhartha Gautama would have been considered a Hindu, even though that term would not have been necessarily applied to him. But Buddhism did arise out of the geographic area of India. And here it's treat not others in ways that yourself would find hurtful. So again, we find this in the negative. Don't do to another person what would be hurtful if done to you. And then moving on into some different traditions. Taoism, again, is a Asian, it's more of it does have a lot of religious connotations, but it's more of a philosophy, and one that fits under what we will call monism, in the sense there's this unity that's a philosophical idea, although it did take on some religious characteristics of a religious hierarchy, of temples and places of practice, but it doesn't necessarily fit squarely. It's also a response to Confucianism. Those are the two Asian religions that are related to one another, but have some differences. So Taoism kind of emerged in relationship and in some ways in reaction to Confucianism. Those are related in some ways, like Buddhism and Hinduism, and like Christianity and Judaism. So here we find a similar understanding, but phrased a little different. Regard your neighbor's gain as your own gain, and your neighbor's loss as your own loss. I think this is an interesting concept. Regard your neighbor's gain. So, and why would you regard your neighbor's gain as your own gain, or your neighbor's loss as your own loss? Here, there points to kind of this essential connectivity that really grounds this. In some ways, it's pointing to the reality that we're not that different from each other. In fact, we are intricately intertwined and interdependent with one another. So the reality is, if you do something that hurts another person, in some ways you're actually hurting yourself. So I like this concept because it doesn't identify the other as that different. And it brings them closer by calling them their neighbor, your neighbor. for me, this is nice because it's the other is not so other, as the assumption is in some of these other understandings of the golden rule, which fits with Taoism, right? There's this unity of reality, though it manifests in these polarities or these differences between light and dark, masculine, feminine. The yin and the yang is the language used in Taoism. And they're all kind of part of each other. They make up a whole. And that's why I kind of like this reframing. That's a little bit different than from the monotheistic traditions, which have this kind of a more clear sense often of the other that Taoism and monism begins to break down. Sikhism, Sikhism is another one that formed kind of out of the Hindu tradition. And here it says, "I am a stranger to no one." And again, here you're beginning to point to this deep sense of a unity that all of us are come from the same source, and therefore not different or not really the other. And I like it starting, "I'm a stranger to no one, and no one is a stranger to me. Indeed, I am a friend to all." And I like that sense of being a friend, because essentially we are manifestations of an essential unity or an essential force. And so what we do to others affects us. What we do to ourselves affects others as well. When we move down to Jainism, would be a similar, came out of the Hindu kind of tradition. And here's named, "One should treat all creatures in the world as one would like to be treated." I really like what Jainism does here, and Jainism is really known for anthropomizing or making human morality, and you see it does a real beautiful extension of that to all creatures, and I really like that. It's a realization that's not just about how we treat other humans, it's how we treat other sentient beings or the planet itself. And we'll see an example of that out of the indigenous tradition. But I like this reframing, how we treat all creatures. Jainism is also known for wearing a mask so you don't breathe in gnats or animals and kill them, or sweeping in front of you, and kind of an extreme morality in that sense of all creatures would sweep your path so that you don't step on another creature, which would be a form of harming them. So the morality of Jainism and the practice of that really does extend it beyond a human-centric or anthropocentric center as a morality. And I think that's a beautiful move, and probably an important critique and expansion of this morality to involve all creatures. Now, what we're going to see in the Native American tradition is it gets expanded even more than that. We are as much alive as we keep the earth alive. And I really appreciate this, right? Because it just basically says that we are a manifestation of the earth. And so that we have to see our interdependence with the earth as a basis for morality. And if we hurt the earth or the creatures on the earth or other humans that are a manifestation of the earth or nature, then we are doing that to ourselves. And so here you can see that morality extending to almost a cosmology rather than an anthropocentric morality. So that gives you some framing of all of these different world traditions. And as you can see, there's a little bit of difference in these. And yet they're very similar. And we can look at it as a moral stance of reciprocity, in the sense of treating the other as you would want to be treated. And there's some different framings of it. But again, it is a universal concept, but you can see some of the nuances based upon the cosmology or the different religious traditions. So that anytime we come across a principle that's has multiple manifestations across cultures and across time, we pay attention. And so this is pretty universal with some nuances. What I want to look at now is understanding it, some of the strengths and weaknesses to the concept of the golden rule. Some of the strengths, again, it has universal quality and appeal, and that's important to pay attention to. It seems to be a very good reflective pedagogical tool, which is just a form of teaching. And it's the idea of reciprocity. So, and I think it's more helpful for certain lower levels of development. Probably for children, this is one of the first kind of moral compasses that they can begin to work with. One is because I know what I want and don't want. And then in general, I can ask that about the other. So here's the plus of it is it starts with me understanding what I want or what I don't want. But we're going to look and see that that's a real weakness too. Whenever we use a morality based upon self-reference, we run into some trouble. And that's what's going to be, that's one of the things I'm going to talk about here in a moment. But at certain levels, it's a real good tool. In fact, I remember coming across this when I was a child, being raised in the Christian Baptist tradition, that it was a good kind of moral compass for me as a child because I could know what I wanted. Now, this is where we move into some of its weaknesses. In one way, it's not practical in the sense that it, in some ways, is not universal. Because if I reference my own experience for what I want or don't want, my experience may be very different than another person's experience. So it's kind of hard to make real practical examples. For example, like, would I want my teacher to give me an F on a paper? So no, I wouldn't want that. So should I not give my students an F on their paper? Right? Or would I want the police officer to not arrest me or give me a ticket? No, I wouldn't want that. So is that a practical law that nobody should get a ticket for speeding? So here you see that it's got some significant limitations to make practical laws because it is so subjective. It runs into some challenges as universal laws can be made. It's a nice principle, but it's not practical. And the second, which is really the main concern, it centers one's own limited perspective. And this is really its challenge. It uses my self-referential awareness and then applies it to the other. And this is the real problem in some ways with morality today. It's not helpful for post-conventional morality, and I'm going to talk in just a minute about post-conventional reality that has to deal with the complexities. Conventional morality, it may be okay, or even pre-conventional morality, child's morality. But when we start moving into higher levels of complexity or realizing that we're not a good self-referential model for the other, that's where it has some problems. And it does not invite listening and relationship. Again, it centers me on me and doesn't invite me to ask the question what the other wants. And fifth, it does not provide a critique to normative culture, power, and systemic privilege. And here, I think this is where it runs into some of the, because I am situationally in a context of my identities and my experience, which is a white male Christian, individualistic and capitalistic, my reference point would include those things as what I think the other may want and need. And I'll get to that more, but I really think this is one of its weaknesses. So now I want to phrase it in the context of moral development. There's a couple of different moral development models. This is from Lawrence Kohlberg, who did work based upon Piaget's cognitive development. But what he looked at is, as we go through life, we go through these different moral stages of development. What we call pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. And there are different aspects of these based upon the person's ability to integrate complexity or different perspectives. So we see that morality grows in a logical sense. And this is the real challenge to Kohlberg, is the experiment was, he asked, basically in short, your spouse or your partner is dying, and they need a medicine which the local pharmacist has, but you can't afford it. It's too expensive. And the moral dilemma that they ask people is it moral, or is it okay for you to go and steal the medicine that your partner needs, in this case it was your wife, needs in order to survive? So they asked this question starting with young, and here's the challenge, is Kohlberg used boys and followed them through different life stages and asked the same question, and then compared their answers at different life stages to see if there was a moral complexity that developed. And there was. The challenge is he used men, or the masculine way of understanding morality, which tended to be rational, justice oriented rather than feeling and emotionally based upon feelings and emotions. So what they found is that people did answer that differently when they could begin to have greater degrees of integrating other perspectives. And so these are some of the stages that they go through. I'm not going to go through those necessarily. But again, this is where we find the problem in the golden rule. If I center my thinking about what would another person want based upon what I want or need, there's a real limitation. And there's a real limitation here in what Lawrence Kohlberg did, because he used the assumption of masculinity to say that we all go through moral development the same. And so the critique of that was what Carol Gilligan came across, and she called it a morality of ethics of care. And she found very similar that people do go through stages of complexity in their moral development, from pre-conventional, conventional to post-conventional. She used the word love, though, which is different than justice or a rational moral concept. It's how many people can you hold in your heart and care for? And what she found is in the feminine moral development, it's more around how many people can you hold in your heart and therefore take their perspective. And it moves from I love me to I love you to I love you that's more than me, and then I love myself and you. And they found that the feminine aspect understands moral development in similar stages, but it's how many people can I hold in my heart, not just in my moral thinking. And how can I differentiate you from me? And at higher levels of the feminine, I realized that basically I can hold in my heart. I can love you the way I love myself, and I love my children, and I love my tribe. And you see that morality is related to care rather than moral thinking, which is what Kohlberg did. In all of them, we find that what happens in moral development, hopefully, is that we move our big heart and big mind. If we're going to integrate Gilligan and Kohlberg's, we can say that really moral development is just how many perspectives and how many people can we hold in our minds and in our hearts. And hopefully that grows from egocentric, ethnocentric, sociocentric, world-centric to cosmocentric. And this really is the challenge, and why, if you're growing and your morality takes in more people's perspectives, then the golden rule works. But if you're not growing and you continue to reference yourself or your own ego, then it falls short of being a universal moral principle. So we can kind of see how that manifests. But anyway, that's the golden rule understood in moral development theory, and how in many ways it kind of breaks down at higher levels of moral development, because the person no longer references themselves in relationship to the morality of treating the other. So this is where I want to move towards looking at some other options. The platinum rule, which you may have heard of, does something that's really different, and I think this is important. It says, do unto others as they would want done to them. So you see what happens there is it moves the reference from me to them. And I think that's really important. The platinum rule does that. It encourages then listening and understanding the other. What does the other really want and need? And my assumption of what they want to need is just that. It's my assumption. So it encourages us to actually be in relationship with the other, to understand what they would want and need. And then that is what I would do to them or for them or not do to them. And it creates an imperative of relationship. So I think the platinum rule really is more helpful. It invites me to see the world and what another person wants from their perspective and not from mine. This, I want to share a story. This is a friend of mine that I was talking to, and I was asking some questions about, and I went to him. He's a young Latinx, and so I went to have a conversation with him about how I could be helpful to the Latinx population. He does a lot of work with the Latinx population, and I was interested in how I could be helpful. And so we had a cup of coffee, and I asked him that question. I was like, I really want to have some time and energy and focus, and would like to, know how I could be helpful to the Latinx community. And it was so funny. He kind of got this look on his face, and he said, well, that's kind of part of the problem, Judd, is that why is it that you think you can be helpful to the Latinx population? And so what he was inviting me into the realization that I was using my own context for that question. I thought that I had something, or I could do something to help the Latinx population. And he got a smile on his face, and I could tell where he was going with this, and he was very gentle but very clear. He said, there's not a whole lot about your culture, about the white, male, middle class, capitalistic, individualistic culture that I want, or that I think the Latinx community needs. He said, yeah, your community. He said, what you can do is heal your own community, and then maybe we can partner in healing the spaces between us. And that was a real beautiful answer. But you see, that's the point, is I was using my own reference of my own context to ask how I could be helpful. Now, he did end up coming around and saying, well, you can be helpful in some ways about helping us have access to the same resources that you had, in order that brought you to the place where you thought you could be helpful to my community. And I really heard that answer and thought it was really profound. And I've always remembered that my context is very limited. And I need to be very careful about thinking that my context has anything to offer somebody else. He was inviting me into the platinum rule. And this is really the challenge that I think we're facing right now, is what we call whiteness as a context for our perception of what we think other people need. And so whiteness is not, again, about white people. Instead, it's about a complex, situated, normative, and hidden worldview, culture, and operating system of power and privileges, which are afforded to and accessed by white people, and consciously and unconsciously propagated for their personal and collective benefit. So if we are asking the golden rule and are not aware of the whiteness, for those of us that are white and participate in it, then we are using our own reference to ask questions about how we treat other people. And this is the real challenge that we're faced with, is that we have to understand our own limited context. So, do unto others as they would want done to them invites us into relationship. It invites us into realizing our own context. But I think the golden rule and even the platinum rule can be expanded upon by the realization that there's a spiritual element involved in this morality. And I think some of them point to this. And this is what I would call is the spirit rule that most of these traditions would invite us to realize. And this is, do unto others as they would want done to them. So immediately I'm referencing the other within universal ethical principles, right? So then I'm pointing to these larger principles, and as the Spirit inspires. So there I'm pointing to a reality that connects all of us, that I'm also listening to. So here I'm listening to a variety of things. I'm listening to others, my relationship with others. I'm listening to what they say. I'm listening to universal ethical principles. For example, like the universal human rights, right? Because in some ways those transcend individual contexts. But I'm listening to those. And I'm listening to the Spirit. I'm listening to the space between us. I'm listening to God. I'm listening to all of these different contexts when I'm asking a question about morality. And I really think this is in some ways better than just the golden rule, what we would call the spirit rule. So it invites us to listen to all of these different places at once before we decide how we want to act towards another person. And it invites in the Spirit that may give us guidance. In some ways, I found this in the Islamic tradition, that I think one of their critiques, they're often have a similar critique that a lot of the mystical traditions hold, is there is a transcendent unity that we can all participate in. That is the Spirit that manifests all of us. In the Sufi tradition is the mystical element of Islam. And Islam often talks about if you bow and surrender to God, God will make your ethical choices right if you'll listen to God. And so in a lot of our mystical traditions, you have this experiential nature of resting in the life and the Spirit of God that then gives direction. And an example of this, I'm not going to get into the dialogical conversations that we need to have, the importance of dialogue, but I just mentioned it, that the spirit rule invites us to listen at different levels of conversation. This all kind of points us to the final one, which we may want to call the love law. And here is what Augustine said. Augustine says, love God and do whatever you please. Now, I think that can get challenging, again, if our limited perspective of God is really limited. But in the mystical tradition, that would be, love God, participate in the life of God. And then our pleasure, what we want, will flow from that. So, and he also, Augustine doesn't finish there. We often just quote Augustine there, but he also says, for the soul trained in love to God will do nothing to offend the one who is beloved. And so I kind of think that is ultimately a beautiful kind of moral challenge for us, is to listen to ourselves, listen to the ones we're in relationship with, what they say they want and need. Listen to universal moral, ethical principles, and then listen to the Spirit of God that flows through all of us. Then do unto others as we would, or act towards others based upon listening to all of those different spheres, people, and places in our lives. So that's essentially my golden rule, is what I would call the integrative, mystical, multi-perspectival, dialogical, platinum spirit love law, aka the golden rule. So that is kind of the thoughts about the golden rule from Interfaith Perspectives. And I want to open it up. I don't know if there's any questions or thoughts on Facebook that you would like to offer. You're welcome to do that. Or if anybody on Zoom has a comment that's showed up, or a question or a point that they would like to make, feel free to unmute yourself and engage in the conversation.
Hey,
Terry?
Judd.
Yeah.
Yeah. First of all, just flipping that and seeing the other side of that. I think my brain is going to be playing with that for some days to come, because it's really seemed so meaningful to me. And I think it, I don't have to toss it out, but also to see the restrictions to that, the things that you named. And it was just very insightful, I think. But one of the things that it also made me think about doing it to others as I would have them done unto me, is thinking about like those in our community who like rules, and they do want to see a community and a state and a world that reflects their religious views, and kind of helps me be a little bit more understanding of where they're coming from. So I get really puzzled, like, because I'm a huge fan of separation of church and state, for instance, and certain freedoms that come with that. But to see that, how that's kind of hard for them to maybe identify with, because they do want to see, they're more comfortable, and it feels right to them to live in a world that has these other laws and regulations, and there's a comfort for them in that. But anyway, that's just one of the things that came up for me with listening to the conversation today and the presentation. And I know that I'll continue, like I said, to play around with it. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Terry. Yeah, and I think that brings up a really good question. And I think that's, asking, that's the moral stages of development question, that realizing that people are in different levels of complexity of what they can actually integrate. If you don't have a sense of, if you're a child and you're just developing your own sense of self, you can't take the perspective of an other. So like the Piaget uses this example. If you've got a basketball and you paint part of the basketball white and the other part stays orange, and you spin the basketball in front of this group of 4-year-olds, and you stop it, and where they see white and the orange part is facing you, and you ask, what color is the basketball? And you ask 4-year-olds, and they'll say, you ask, what color do you see? And they'll say, well, they see white. And if you ask them, what color do I see? They'll say white. Right? So because they don't cognitively understand your perspective, right? They don't have the capacity to see through your eyes because they only see what they see, but they can't in their brain say, oh, well, I remember seeing the other side, but they don't do that. So what we have to be very aware of is that people actually have limited cognitive abilities to do perspective taking. So we can't invite them into a morality that's more complex than their cognitive ability to integrate. And I think that's one of our challenges, is that sometimes there are these, universal principles that they can't even grasp cognitively. And so I think that's where we have to be, show a lot of compassion while also not saying there are these universal principles, right? And being a mystic, right, is a high level of like spiritual awareness. So it assumes you've gone through, pre-personal, personal, and post-personal forms of development. So you can say, somebody that's a mystic or at a conventional form of morality can say, listen to God. But if you say, listen to God from to a 6-year-old, that only concept of God is this man that looks a lot like their dad and, is very patriarchal and will punish you for doing bad, right? That's the good boy, good girl attitude. They will project that onto the divine, and then they'll have a very paternalistic, vitriolic, could be wrathful form of God, right? So you wouldn't want to say, well, we want to base our moral principles on that, right? Because we would want to say, and that's where the real challenge comes, right? Like we don't want to ground universal moral principles in a 6-year-old's form of development, while we also want to understand a 6-year-old's form of development. The challenge is we have 6-year-olds that are running countries. They just don't have the moral capacity to see another person's perspective. And while we have compassion for that, we're not going to let them create the laws of our land. So here, right, we're holding all of these complexities. And I think that's what we have to say, is that, it's unfortunate that we don't have a cultural curriculum that allows people to do multiple perspective taking. And I think that's our real challenge, is we have to create communities of safety, communities where people have what they need. And then what we know is that people can take multiple perspectives in those kind of environments. So thanks, Terry. That was a long way of getting at your question, but that's why I think it's really important.
That was perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for joining. And tomorrow, actually at 3, I'm going to look at the kind of the very question that I was going into there at the end. I'm going to look at worldview developmental stages and ask the question, based upon where we are, how can we use the gifts and perspectives of the whole spectrum in order to create common good? And this is what I think is the real challenge in our world today, is how do we honor multiple perspectives while not letting any one perspective take control. So anyway, you feel free to join us tomorrow for looking at the gifts of the different worldviews and how those can all be used for the common good. Thanks for joining us today. May you have a blessed afternoon. Peace be with you.
And also with you.
Thank you.
Thanks.